All right. So quick outline for everyone. We have plenty of time to get through all of this. We have a lot of content if you have or haven't seen the deck, which we'll walk through. But as Jane said, I'd really like to have a discussion about this. We'd both really like to have a discussion about this. We've been interested in the Montana resource for a while for the cost stuff, as we'll see. And we'd love to have a discussion with folks to see what your expertise says. So with that said, outline for today, just go through some definitions, look at the key transmission paths to the Northwest, the ratings for them, contracts that are existing, and most importantly, how the utilization of those looks today and how it looked 10 years ago, and what that says for us when we start to think about resource costs. And then we'll summarize and have a discussion together. But as Julian said, interrupt any time. I hope that we can have a good discussion along the way. So goals. So just to restate, we are really hoping to have a shared discussion on, we'll be presenting how flows on major paths in the region have changed over time. Really focused for today, just to keep the scope relatively narrow and focused for webinar. Focus today on out of Montana and into the Northwest, but looking a little bit at the implications from other paths. What to expect from the trends we're seeing going forward, and then most importantly, thinking about those trends, what impacts does that have on resource planning for the region? So that's us and the 8th power plan that we'll be assembling, in the coming years, and then also for regional utilities. So a few generalized definitions here. So path is just a WEC-defined group of transmission lines that generally carry energy in a similar direction. So we'll look at a couple here today, but you'll hear me say over and over, Path 8 is really what we're focused on. It's a group of lines coming out of Montana. We'll talk a little bit about cut planes, which are a line in space that group together all major transmission lines passing through it. Flow gates, which are important locations along the path where power flow is metered. So that's how you really get a sense of what utilization you have, is checking the flow through a particular flow gate. And then most importantly for today, and you'll see this over and over, is utilization. So for today, that's really how much a path is physically used relative to its capability. In general, in planning, we talk about the available transmission in terms of its ability to sell a long-term firm contract for some additional long-term firm contract. That's not what we're talking about here. Here we're really talking about the extent to which the transmission system is, the wires are being heated up to their capacity at all times or not, and how that's changed over time. So all the data that you're going to see here today is showing east to west flow. And what's important about that is, underlying that, so it could be some west to east schedules, so that the net effect at the flow gate is, some people are counting on energy moving east to west, some people are counting on energy moving west to east. The flow gate just shows the net effect of that. But the trend should be the same. So just a quick look at the region. This is not every path, but these are some of the paths. This is actually from the WEC website. We're going to be looking at a lot of our own data through this, but I thought this was kind of a good start. So you can see kind of up in the top right, Path 8 in western Montana near the border with Idaho. I'll have a more detailed look in a second, but that's Path 8. And what these colors indicate, and then interestingly, also you can see Path 6, where it really grabs two groups of lines on cut plane, both of which are generally carrying power in the same direction. And then what the colors here indicate, this is just a part of the study that WEC has done for a long time, is the colors indicate the percent of time that a given path is operating above 75% of its operating limit, 75% or more. So in other words, if you look at Path 66, kind of at the California-Oregon border, that's the AC tie to California. So showing that at least 30% of the time, it is above 75% of its capability for utilization. So it's, a well-utilized line. Most of the other paths, in the WAC, are substantially lower than that on a generalized basis. Okay. So transmission owners, so there are many transmission owners in the region. I just want to specifically call it BPA because BPA is, primary owner of Path 8. They own majority of the Path 8 capacity. So they own the Federal Columbia River Transmission System. Their BPA Transmission Services provides transmission across that under its open access tariff. Typically, as I was saying, the rights to that transmission are sold on a long-term firm basis, which is essentially a reservation to send energy. Whether you use it or not, you own that position. And what I'm going to kind of describe here, and we'll talk about the implications, have a discussion about it with your input, is that can lead clearly to underutilization, since that reservation is held no matter what, whether you use it or not, whether market conditions change or not, whether you might be better served, given utility holding that position, might be better served doing something different after 20 years or not. They still own that right, and in the case, for example, of Path 8, they have basically a never-ending, long-term ability to roll those rights over and over and over through time. So other transmission owners, other utilities in the region, which we're not going to talk about because we don't have access to their data publicly, but they're also obliged to offer their transmission through an open access tariff. Okay, so I just want to try to, I guess, summarize what we mean when we talk about the available transmission capability or available transfer capability, ATC. It's a very common phrase. I actually started looking into this quite a while ago, but since I kicked this off, this work, there's also been some additional outside work, which I'll mention later, looking specifically at Montana renewables development that BPA and the Montana Governor's Office are leading. And there's a lot of work on this, but just to state kind of the definition, so we're all looking at the same common understanding. ATC is the amount of long-term firm transmission available to sell on a path after accounting for existing contracts. So in other words, it has nothing to do with how much a line is utilized. It just has to do with how many blocks of unreserved power still exist out there. And to that extent, for example, on Path 8, there is zero ATC, regardless of how much it is or is not utilized, which does not change anything about, the ability for the owners to transmit power down there. It's really just acts as a barrier for any newcomers to get on the line. So in BPA's case, and this is generalized, but BPA has a couple specific offerings, but basically for everyone, it's how much capacity do you have, what's your path rating, minus what are your existing firm commitments. So in BPA's case, that's point to point, and then also all their network transmission customers, and any other commitments that they would have. And then there's a reliability margin built in there too. So that's what drops it down just slightly. Got some links down here if you want to take a look. So before I move on, I just want to take a quick pause and see if there are any questions. I did see one person is asking a question, if we could send the slides. Happy to. Also, they're available on our website if you go to the GRAC homepage. Okay. Any other questions I can answer before we kind of dive in? Okay. So I've mentioned a couple of times so far, but the transmission paths of focus. So for today, it's primarily Path 8, just to keep the scope narrow. Our reason for looking at this is there's a strong regional interest in evaluating the Montana wind resource. We want to make sure in our power planning process in the development of 8th plan, in 7th plan, we looked at it, tried to estimate the cost of transmission, how much can be built without it, and so on. And we just want to make sure that we have the most up-to-date information. We feel like, it's a value to the region because I've seen it in pretty much everybody's IRPs also. So there's a lot of interest in it. And then also, we observe that the operational culture is changing. And, that has implications for, for example, how much opportunity there might be for a transmission owner to utilize their capacity in some other way, or for, potentially that transmission right to roll over or whatever. I've also done a lot of analysis, which we're not going to talk about as much today, but on Path 66, which is the California-Oregon intertie, our main route south, and then Path 65, which is the DC tie. I'm bringing those up here today only in the sense of describing how what's changing there has had an impact on the behavior of Path 8. And there's really some very clear correlations between the two. So just a slightly more detailed, but still generalized discussion of Path 8. So Path 8 is a 500 kV line, in general 500 kV set of lines from western Montana to the northwest. It's really the only major export path out of Montana?
Checking account?
No.
Oh, well, someone's unmuted and just had to happen to say no at that time. But anyway,
Hey, hold on, Mike. Rick Williams, it looks like you're not on mute.
Oh. Okay, thank you.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, so we would expect high utilization at the west of Garrison Flowgate, which is the farthest east point of Path 8 on the BPA system, given the purpose-built nature of exporting energy out of Montana. So let's take a really close look at this, and then I'll pause for questions. This is a kind of an eye chart, but the reason that I think it's worth looking at in detail is because, number one, is I often go back to this, and it's hard to, these are kind of the key aspects of how this line is utilized and who would have rights to utilize it and so on. And so it's really helpful as a reference. So on the very far right, we have the Colstrip plant. So units 1 and 2 are 307 megawatts apiece. The set to retire in 2022 and own 50/50 PSC and Talon. And then units 3 and 4, built a little later, are 750 megawatts a pop, own 30/30 Northwestern and Talon, and then PSC at 25% on both units, PG at 20% on both units, and VIST at 15% on both units, and then Pacific Core 10% on both units, with no set retirement. Colstrip, kind of in the middle of nowhere, and it has a transmission line to substation Broadview. And if you look kind of in the top right, looking at this pie chart, this is showing the transmission capacity between the Colstrip plant and the Broadview substation. So it's 2,260 megawatts. And the pie chart there showing who owns what slice of that. The key thing I would point out there, and this is what you'll see in the next phase, is Northwestern owns a pretty big slice of that, of that total transmission position. And what you'll see here in a second is that basically drops off after Broadview. Broadview is an export path into Northwestern's own system. So everyone else's position more or less stays flat, and Northwestern shrinks a little bit. So you get to Broadview, substation, be an opportunity for any additional resources, for example, to potentially connect. I think a lot of folks have looked at that, seen it in a few IRPs. So from Broadview, the next stop, which is not a physical stop, but the next stop is Townsend. It's just a location in Montana. I don't know if there's any physical equipment there, but it's a change of ownership there. That's really where the ownership switched from this group of owners, Northwestern, PSC, PGE, Avista, and PAC, to BPA. And so when you, commonly what you'll hear, sorry, I just was looking at a question. Someone asked if I can become the presenter.
Don't worry about that, Elizabeth. Yeah, I think that's an automated, yeah, don't worry about that.
Okay, all right, okay. I was going to say, I mean, I was planning to do the presentation today, but if someone else wants to kick off. But anyway, that group on the right, the kind of the combined ownership group, where you see basically a perfect alignment between, you know, the owners of the Colstrip unit itself, and then the owners of CTS, the Colstrip transmission system. You know, once you get to Townsend, although nothing changes, you just have an ownership shift from, you know, the Colstrip CTS to the east, what BPA calls the Eastern Intertie. And then collectively, just to add one more layer of confusion, that whole group is called the Montana Intertie. But all that, if you just take a zoom out, everything on the right is Northwestern's balancing authority area, their BAA. And then you kind of see this curved line, and everything to the left of that is BPA's system. So the first substation in BPA's system along Path 8, which is, you know, starting there, is Garrison. So Garrison is a metered substation, and it's known as the west of Garrison Flowgate into Path 8. And all the data that we'll look at today, all the Path 8 flow data, is based on west of Garrison flow. So just numbers straight out of there. And that's really where I meant, you know, if, for example, you have a sale of energy or, you know, contract for energy coming, you know, from Colstrip to, Portland or wherever. And then also simultaneously at that, at that same hour, Northwestern has, for whatever reason, or a wholesale customer or whatever, has a contract with some resource west of Garrison to move power east. The net effect, seeing at the Garrison substation, will be the net total between those two. If you had 1,000 megawatts out, 200 megawatts in, you'd meter 800 at Garrison out. So that's what I just wanted to highlight with that. And just to put a map to it, here is the where these sit in the country. So if you look down at, so if you look at the top left, you see that Townsend with the little black star thing. That's that town where nothing is there, but there's a change of ownership from the CTS, the Colstrip Transmission System owners, to BPA. And then at the yellow line, that's the west of Garrison flow gate. And then just for reference here, you see that red line coming out of there, that's a BPA transmission line, and it's going to Butte. That's that little town there. So you see west of Garrison. BPA calls this entire area, it's Montana to Northwest area. But in particular, west of Garrison is known as its Montana to Northwest flow gate. And so you can see any energy coming out of there, is basically going to go then through the west of Hatway flow gate, which crosses, if it's going to BPA system, which crosses, all the major lines along this purple cut plane here. And then the only other tie into this, general region is the southward boundary tie up at the north. And just to point out, if you're kind of looking at the top right up there, you can see kind of where the red line stop. You can see Libby and Hungry Horse being, over there on the other side of the flow gate. And then it used to be that you could download transmission maps, and that changed, and you can't anymore. So instead, I have a Google Maps driving direction. So you can see that if you were to take a scenic tour from Colstrip to Garrison, it would take you about 6 hours, and that's just the general location of where these, the plant to the change of ownership. I didn't list Broadview here, but you can see it just as kind of a data point there to Garrison at the far left. So before I move on to start looking at the trends in the utilization, are there any questions about WEC Path 8 and the owners and so on? Okay. So just looking at Path 8 utilization, the typical shape, so down here I have the plot. This is a 10th order line of best fit for what it looked like in 2007. And basically what you can see is that in general, so this this y-axis here, this is the most important part that I could share. Just want to make sure no one, it's not the most important part of the presentation, but it's the most important key I want to hit. It's important to understand is the y-axis is not flow, it's the availability. So I could have shown flow, that would be the opposite. But the reason I didn't is because it could be at a given moment that, you have some limited amount of flow relative to what the line, could handle on its greatest best day. But it might be that the line is derated at that moment due to, line outage or generator outage that causes some instability concerns or so on, which would lower the, what we call the TTC, which is the total transfer capability at that moment. So this, instead I plotted this blue line, which is for every given, this is all based on 15-minute data. So at every 15-minute interval, I just took, well, how much power could possibly have been sent down there? And I subtracted from it how much is being sent down there. And then the blue line is that answer. So if you look, for example, in April and May, you can see that, April, May, June, there's, more than 1,000 megawatts available to send east to west. That's obvious. It's obvious why that would be. It's because we have the spring runoff during that time. There's not a substantial need or any need in most years to send power from the east to the west, at least during our heavy hours. And so you can see in general that we have substantial amount of availability there. But still, you can see just on a trend basis that there's overall a substantial amount of energy that's available. One problem, of course, is these are just lines of best fit. Doesn't show your hourly shape, doesn't show your peaks, and so on. But it's good for trends. So I just want to layer on that 2007 here. I just want to layer on 2008. And I didn't pick these. I'll have a graph of the water year. This wasn't intentional. I haven't chosen any years that are especially bad or especially good to draw any particular characteristic. I'll show the water years in a little bit. It turns out just by chance that they're actually really comparable water years. But actually, I picked 07, and then so here's 08. I picked 07 and 08 as my back years just because it was 10 years ago. That's it. And then I add on 2016 and 2018, or 2017 rather, which I picked those because there are most recent years. But if you plotted every year in between, you just see a line moving up here. And what this shows is, if you look at those lines, I'll just back up here. What this shows is, so here's 2007 on a yearly basis, relatively tight on a relative basis in the fall, pretty much wide open in the spring, or in the spring runoff months. 2008 shows, a pretty similar trend, something a little bit different in kind of that, seasonal shoulder months, a little more availability. Higher line means more available, less utilized. And then if you jump forward to 2016, and then I'll layer on 2017, you can see, pretty substantial shift up. You're definitely talking about, just looking at line of best fit, hundreds of more megawatts on an annual basis, pretty much every month, except for the shoulder months, which remain to be pretty tight. But on an annual basis, you can see pretty substantial increase in availability. And we'll dig into that here in a second. So if you're not that familiar with a duration curve, this is kind of a separate look at what we just said, and I'll look at this, cut this up in a bunch of different ways. But this is an availability duration curve. And what this shows is nothing more than, I took my whole data set of availability across the 10-year period, across each year. So this is 2007. And basically all I did is I just sorted it in descending order, from highest to lowest. And what that gives you, if you then plot that, is it tells you, how often you had a certain level of availability, right? So like if you look at the kind of towards the far right, that's saying, 90% of the time, if you kind of think about this, 90% of the time you had a number bigger than whatever this is, 300 or whatever. So that's saying, 90% of the time you had 300 more megawatts, at least 300 megawatts available, and probably more. Move over, the 30%, it's like 30% of the time, if I looked at this cross, it looks like about 1,000. So about 30% of the 15-minute intervals in the data set had 1,000 or more megawatts of availability. So let me layer on another year. So here's 2008.
So Mike,
you can see, yes.
Yeah, Mike's Fred. So sorry to interrupt, but just wondering, TTC is just set as a static number. Is there, I don't really know this, and there are others on the call who might, are there significant reductions of based on changes in a system operating limit or other kinds of constraints that actually reduce the amount of physical transfer capacity on the line, or is that more or less not a big factor?
So it's a good question. If anyone wants to chime in after I'm done with my first answer, I'm happy to hear it. But actually the TTC, there was a switch in BPA's methodology from an SOL, or from TTC to SOL. But actually, this data, the TTC in this is dynamic, and it does move up and down depending on the outage situation and so on. If you look back through the record, there are times when it's reduced substantially. And that's why I chose to use availability as TTC minus actual. Is if there was an outage, it shows up, or some limit to the flow, it shows up as a reduction in TTC in the data set. So it's not a fixed number, and it does change over time. What do you think about that? Does that satisfy you? If you go on BPA's website, you can pull this off too, and if you just pick up 1 month, they'll show a plot, and it'll have the actual flow and the TTC at that time plotted, and you can see that it moves around and is reflected as a real-time number in the data set.
Hey, Mike, this is Tomas Morris here at PNUCC.
Hey, Tomas.
Hey, so if the value moves around a bit, do you know roughly where it usually is? Does it usually sit around, can you give me an idea of the headroom usually?
So I'll get into some hourly shapes, but of course it depends on the hour. You know, this is a look across the year, and I did a lot of analysis on peak, off peak, and so on and so forth, which I'll have some of that in here. But there's no real fixed number. It really depends on. So like one thing you'll see when we get a little further is there's a lot more availability in the on peak hours in the winter versus the off peak hours, which is a little surprising until you think about it. So does that seem reasonable? Once we kind of look into it, I'll show you what a typical year looks like.
Great, thanks.
Okay, cool. So sorry, and just since we had a couple questions, is there anyone else who wanted to chime in? Okay, so just jumping forward here, so here you can see I'm going to layer on 2016 and 2017, and there's a clear move up. And what this shows, and by the way, again, I didn't select these years. I've only put 4 years on here because otherwise it's hard to look at. But if you layer on next year and the next year and the next year and the next year and the next year, you'll see this trend where it's, you know, in general rising. And a move upward basically says, you know, if you grab, for example, that 20% mark, you know, the bottommost line is 2007. And so in 2007, you know, let's say the number there, the y-intercept is, you know, 1350. So in 2007, there was at least 1,350 megawatts available 20% of the time. For the next year, there's a little more, maybe 50 more megawatts. And then, you know, you go up to 2016, 2017, there's probably 500 more megawatts. You know, there's 500 additional megawatts available at that same level of availability 20% of the time. So, and just to state, again, this isn't looking at when that is. I will look at that. I will show that here shortly. But this is saying, you know, across every 15-minute interval, we're seeing substantially more availability. You know, so that's a key trend. You know, that takes away a lot of, you know, what's happening in this set and this set of time and so on. But we'll look at that. And just to show, you know, this is some annual runoff data from 2007. So it happens that, and I didn't think of this initially, or didn't intend for this initially, but it happens that 2007 and 2008 were both slightly below average, and then 16 and 17 were also slightly below average. This is percent from average runoff at the Dalles. If anyone's interested in seeing this plot just through all of time, it's a good plot. I'm happy to send it to you. Just feel free to ask. It does matter, I would say. It matters when that water comes off. This is annual runoff. I mean, it obviously matters when that comes off. But I think, you know, as we kind of push on a little further, you'll see you can really get away from thinking about was it one specific water year or another when you see what it looks like across all 10 years. So let's take a look at the next plot. So this one might take a second to think about.
Do you see you have a question on the chat?
Oh, yep, I did not. Thank you. So Greg asks, what factors are driving upward trend in ATC? So, so two things. So the one thing I would just say, I'm sure Greg knows this, but I'm probably just trying to shape a couple of keystrokes. But one thing I would just say is just a reminder, there's actually consistently been 0 ATC throughout this entire time. There is no you know, if anyone wanted to go to BPA and buy transmission or, you know, do an interconnection and get transmission rights, BPA would tell them that there is 0 availability on the transmission system and to go ahead and jump in the line, and here's the cost of an upgrade, $1 billion or whatever, because that's the way that transmission is bought and sold. But if you're one of the owners on this line, you know, you will have seen your own position throughout this being less utilized by some action you're taking. So it's a good question, is what is causing the reservations in transmission, which haven't changed, to be less utilized? I've got a couple thoughts on that, but that's kind of one of the main things I hope to go through in the presentation. So if anyone's really anxious to kick in a thought here, that's great. I'm happy to hear it, but otherwise I'm just going to move a little bit forward, pause on this question, and try to share a couple initial thoughts that I have and some data that I looked at. All right, Greg says that sounds good.
Dave Levy, Powercast. I have a quick question, I guess, or perspective that I would be interested in maybe getting some answers to, and that is basically as we look at not stripping out who has ownership of the transmission, but looking at the utilization based upon kind of an optimal view. How does the optimal view of the utilization compare to, when you're looking at basically stripping out who has ownership and how that transmission gets utilized? So there's a conceptual view to say, here's the economic, most advantageous way of using the transmission versus what you're observing in terms of how much gets utilized based upon ownership.
I just want to give anyone else a chance to chime in. Yeah, okay. But when we kind of get to that discussion, see if we can pick that up. Someone says, does this effectively allow Pacific Northwest utilities to access Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado wind? Should we gain benefit of transmission access by RTO membership? I'm going to hold on to that one. It's a good question, but I'm going to hold on to it. Just want to share a couple others on the utilization before we really have that discussion. So, okay, so here's what I'm hoping to show. This will take just a second, but what I'm hoping to show in this this slide is how it's pretty compelling looking across all 10 years, regardless of what's happening in one particular year versus another particular year, they're seeing an upward trend. So what this is showing is if you look along the x-axis, you have years. So 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010. And then what I did is I just looked through the data set for all of 2007, ran a little script, and said, well, what percent of the time was there at least 600 megawatts of availability in 2007? Okay, what percent of the time was there at least 500? Clearly there's, it's gonna be more 500 megawatt 15-minute intervals of availability than 600, obviously. And then it's okay, blah, 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 going out to, here's 300. So like in this case, it's saying in 2007, there was at least 300 megawatts available at, at least 88% of the time. Now, and we'll get back to that discussion that Dave brought up, but one thing to just point out is, that might be totally reasonable. I mean, there's no reason to think, oh, there's some other better and more economic use of that. It could be that during those intervals, there's, those could be intervals of high hydro and where there's not an economic opportunity for power in the east to move west. It's not unreasonable to expect that you wouldn't have 100% utilization all the time. But what I would show is, so then I did the same thing in 2008, 2009, 2010. So the series here are representing the number of 15-minute intervals where there was at least, the light blue 600, the green 500, and so on, at least 600, 500, 400 megawatts over time. And what you can see here, if you look just across time, taking, clearly 2010, something's going on, bad year or whatever, but clearly what you can see across time is an obvious trend of increasing availability, to the order of 20 to 30% more often on some of these major intervals, So if you look at 2007, 75% of the time there was 500 megawatts or more, compare that to 2017, 90% of the time. And nothing changed about the line, it's just how it was utilized. So I think that's, it's an obvious trend. So now let's start to look at a little bit more details. So obviously these are yearly trends. Seasonality clearly matters. It's going to be a major driver for it. So here I just picked up and plotted by month now when there was at least 300 megawatts across those couple of years, right? So this blue line, this is January in 2007, February 2007, and so on. That's the blue line, from January to December. The red line is Same thing, but for 2008, an upward trend. But then jumped ahead, 8, 9, 10 years. The yellow line here, which is more or less hidden by the purple line, is showing, whereas previously you had maybe 80% of the time you had some 300 megawatts of availability, now you have basically 100% of the time you have that much opportunity. So, again, that doesn't mean one person, doesn't mean, for example, that a third-party developer could show up and say, I'm willing to, I can get financing, take the bet that, I'm going to build a 300 megawatt plant and it'll be available for me 97% of the time. That's a risk I'm willing to take. It's not something that they could do because there's no product that they could secure on a long-term firm basis to even provide them the opportunity to access that. So they would have to build it and hope that that capacity is made available on the spot market. On the other hand, one particular transmission path, one particular owner of transmission, long-term firm transmission rights on path 8, also only has a portion of, the total reservation of unused energy. So, it's not a silver bullet for them either, unless it's just one particular owner who's leaving all 300 megawatts unused, which I don't know. I don't have the ability to say what the schedule was and who owned that schedule. It's just not information we have available. So getting away from now a monthly look, so we went from an annual look to a monthly look, and now I think it's really important, obviously, to look at whether this is occurring at a time when, we have load. So there's, obviously the way you want to look at this is, would you have the availability in, number one, the season when you need it, and number two, a time when some resource, remember our whole point in looking at this is we want to get our cost information right. So, then would you have it at a time when a resource is generating? So, for the Montana resource, our understanding with all the information that we have is that it's a winter peaking resource. I don't know whether it's winter day or winter night. I haven't seen that on real data, just synthetic data. But here's a typical 24-hour shape of availability over time. So here I've taken just a slightly reversed order in that I'm starting with 2017. So it's not a complicated plot, but it could take a second because it's not a familiar way of plotting things. What I've got here is you can kind of see, there's individual blocks. Here's a red block, here's another one, and so on. And these represent months. So each, kind of red group is a different month: January, February, March, April, May. And what I did is I just looked across, January of 2017, and I took the typical load or the typical availability in hour 1, the typical availability in hour 2, typical availability in hour 3, and I made a shape that would represent the average 24-hour availability for the month of January for the year 2017, and that's what you see here. So in other words, you can see that in 2017, from basically, if you kind of look to the left, from midnight to 7 or 8 in the morning Pacific time, 9 Pacific time, there's 900 megawatts of availability on average in the year 2017 and the month of January. So there's 900 megawatts in the middle of the night, basically. And then what you can see is there's actually more availability as the day wears on in January, which is a long-term trend. That's not a recent trend. It's a long-term trend. It surprised me, but that's only because I hadn't looked at this data. I think, to me, the explanation is simple, but it could be wrong. But I think what it is just simply that Montana has its own load. So some of the coal strip output, which might have been sold east to west, is just being delivered by Northwestern to their own customers as they wake up and have their own double hump or single winter hump. And then the other part too, in addition to coal strip providing energy, it could be that Northwestern owns projects on the west of Garrison, and it could just simply be that now those hydro projects, they're just scheduling them now to deliver from the west side of the flow gate to the east, which has the effect of reducing the east to west flow, which is how we measure all of this. So if you think about if there was 2,000 megawatts going out of the west of Garrison flow gate, and someone schedules in from that other side of the flow gate, someone schedules in back to Montana, 200 megawatts, the net effect on the flow gate would show that there's some availability, even though no generators, in Montana changed their behavior. So A clear and obvious trend here is more on-peak availability in the winter, and then obviously substantially more availability in the spring when there's basically no market to bring power into the Northwest, or a limited opportunity to bring power in the Northwest because of our spring runoff. So now let me add on 20. I did skip a year here. This is one difference. I added on 2015 because there's a chunk of 2015 in January, or 2016 in January, where there's some data missing in DPA's data set. And since that has such a big impact on the hourly shape, I didn't want to have some skewed look at the hourly shape. So for this one, one figure, rather than having 2016, 2017, I have 2017, 2015, just to be fair, I have a more fair presentation. So if I add on 2015, that's this lighter color. You can see less, in general, less availability, and something about the hydro year in 2015 had less runoff, so that there was clearly more power moving east to west during the springtime. That's what, just as a reminder, this is showing availability. So a bigger bar, like we see here, means there was a greater opportunity to transmit power east to west. Now let me show 2008. So, you can see basically almost all hours, a shift of less availability, which is kind of what I described. I've looked at it the opposite way in all the previous ones, showing, as you move forward in time, you have more availability. Here I'm going back in time, showing you less availability. And then let me layer on now 2007. So that's the cyan color here. So, pretty similar shape basically to 2008. One of the things I want to point out here, we'll talk about March in a second. I think I have a pretty clear answer for why March looks different. But I just want to draw everyone's attention, just to hold this thought, to the early morning hours of January. And what you can see is you're going from, let's say, 500 megawatts of availability in 2007, 2008, right? Somewhere in there on these green ones, to, 700 to 900 megawatts of availability in 15 and 17. And my first thought was, well, Colstrip, something about Colstrip has changed. And that's not the case. And I'll show that in a second. The output of Colstrip is basically flat through January over time. Nothing really changed. So let's look at March. March has also seen a change in availability, where now you have a substantial amount of availability in the middle of the day, and this huge difference where in the middle of the day you have this giant, increase in availability, whereas before you actually saw the opposite. You saw a decrease of availability. And so let's take a look. This is the change in Colstrip output so on the left is 2007, but basically that trend is 2010 and prior. And then beginning in 2011 and on, you're starting to see, so this is 2017, so it's the deepest double dip, but every year other than 2013, which is had more of a past behavior, but 2011, 2012, 2014, 15, 16, 17 kind of had a trend of moving more towards a double hump shape, where you can see that even in the peak of the hump in 2017, the output wasn't full blast. And most of that, is on the backs of Colstrip's units 3 and 4. And I think the reason for that is really is driven by clearly it's economics. And I think what those economics are saying is this, well, let me go to the next slide. So if you look at, this is, I wanted to grab day ahead hourly prices. So I grabbed them from CAISO at the Malin node at the California-Oregon border. And so what you see on the left is blue line is 2010, where we saw a very flat output in March. And then the red line is 2017, where a bunch of, as we all know, a bunch of zero marginal cost resources in California have totally suppressed the midday price. Everyone here is very familiar with that. I think, basically what that says is this, is there are less resources in the Northwest sending power from from our region south. And because of that, there's less opportunity, economic opportunity, for Colstrip to deliver its power east to west. There's essentially an oversupply. The Northwest is not exporting its energy, and therefore it's not importing energy from Colstrip. And so they must take the double hump shape. So the right plot shows the hourly flow down the COI and the PDCI, both of our ties to California, our major ties to California. So 2008 and 2010 are shown kind of at the bottom. 2010 just happened to be, so I don't have LMP data for any year prior to 2010. I put 2010 on here, but it just happened to be a really low flow year, so it's kind of confusing. So I also added 2008, which we have flow data for, but no LMP data for. You know, we're getting to a point of beating this to death, but the point is this: it used to be we would ramp up from low north to south flow. This is north to south flow. So we used to, from the Northwest, transmit most of the energy we transmitted down to California, you know, on peak hours, you know, starting basically at the first hour of the on peak block, you know, to the evening, and then have a slight increase. And now, a lot of folks are aware of this, kind of makes sense. There's no economic incentive to send our power north to south because the LMP is really crappy there. And for that reason, we hold our resources in the Northwest, and we don't import from Colstrip. I'm going to pause here. I'm going to look at January in a second, but I want to pause here. Any questions or comments? Okay, so we're getting to, really close to the point of discussion, so feel free to engage. Sorry for punting a couple of people. So I was really trying to hold off until we went through these couple of slides, and now we can really have discussion. January to me is one area where I really, you know, would find benefit from having discussion about this. I don't have an answer. Thought about it a lot, talked to our staff, not really quite sure. So January shows a trend of increased off-peak availability. That was that kind of morning hour that we looked at, you know, off-peak being overnight. It's kind of looking at those morning hours, you know, it's obvious. I mean, there's hundreds of megawatts more transmission availability in January now compared to 10 years ago. And the plot on the left shows just the, you know, average off-peak availability in January from 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, and so on. So basically, I just said, what's the average availability on the off-peak strip of power, just those, you know, evening hours, overnight hours. You know, so 2007, like we saw, about 500, 2008, slightly more, you know, some dips and so on, kind of a clear trend. You know, really, a lot of these trends really start in 2011. And you can see, you know, comparing these last couple of years or even the last 4 years, you know, not a little, you know, like, yeah, there's some dips in here if you plot an R-squared line, which is not a great way to do transition planning, but if you did, you know, or even if you just looked at the mean difference after 2011, you know, again, 2015 is kind of an oddball year, but, you know, we're talking about hundreds of megawatts. So if you look at then the Colstrip output in January.
Hey, Mike,
Yep.
Jillian, 1 second here. You have a question from the webinar. What hours are you considering off-peak?
Oh, I don't see that. Oh, sorry, I was scrolled up. So on peak is the 16-hour block of is it hour ending 7? It's whatever California also uses. I'm spacing it here. It's I think it's HE7 to 22. Is that right? HE6 to 22. How many hours does that leave? Yeah, it must be 6 to 22, and that leaves 8 hours. Yeah. Okay. John says HE7 through HE22. Yeah, hour ending 22. So that's right. So from 6 a.m. To 10 p.m. Thanks. Okay. It's a good question. You know,
So
that's
this
the way,
is,
you know,
sorry to interrupt. This is Fred. I think that would be HE7 to 22, just so you're not off by 1.
Right. HE7 to 22. Yeah. 6 a.m. to 10 p.m.
Yeah, we would traditionally say in Northwest 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. And then Monday through Friday and maybe Saturday, depending on who's doing it.
So, yeah, okay, it's good. So anyhow, but it's odd. I mean, to me, it's just odd. So, that's good. I appreciate the help clarifying that. What I'd really love is if you help me answer this question, which is, where does that availability come from? I don't know. It's not clear to me if that's a trend we could count on. I mean, certainly it could be Northwestern has a change in their, so let me jump ahead and kind of kick off some discussion that I really would appreciate some discussion on. So a couple key conclusions. So Path 8 has, I put almost no ETC. I mean, really it has zero ATC. If you went to BPA and tried to interconnect, there's some potential opportunity through some, electrical engineering that they could get a couple 100 megawatts of ATC as a no build, but basically nothing. But nevertheless, despite having zero ATC for long-term firm sales, there's an increasing amount of unutilized physical capability. I think the Colstrip price response, like I was showing for March, helps explain some of it. But other months like January, I'm not sure, and I don't know what I would, so taking that in balance with the availability of transmission or the need for new transmission for regional resource development for our next power plant, I'm not quite sure what to think of that. I don't know, that's why we, engage with you and hope for your input. So here's where I'm going to kind of stop talking, which is great. A couple discussion points, and then we can go back. So I'll start by opening it up, and then we'll make sure we go back to the few things that were brought up before. But in general, I'm wondering, how this aligns with everyone's expectations of what's happening in Montana and when. And then kind of the next part, this is the hardest part for us, most important part, is what impacts does it have on, resource costs? How should we be thinking about this given the ATC versus utilization issue? And does that change any, assumptions in anybody's planning? Not sure what we think yet. And then kind of the third point, which I really just put in there in case the other two didn't hit anything, is there anything else that we should be studying that would have an impact on this cost? So let me open it up for any questions, comments, thoughts on any of this stuff, and then we'll go through a couple of the questions that came up earlier.
So this is Fred. Interesting stuff. I think there are probably multiple factors going on here. One is, we're starting to see some impact from especially the last couple of years, starting to see impact from the duck curve, which is a pretty big factor in the winter and spring in California because they have a fair bit of solar and fairly low load. The second thing is the difference between January and March is very interesting, and it makes me immediately think, does that have something to do with what's happening in the hydro system, where in January, Northwest loads are pretty high, and BPA and the other hydro generators are running a lot. But in March, even though loads are going to be somewhat lower, BPA is drafting a lot of the system, still waiting for the runoff. Would that, in effect, crowd out some of the flow coming out of Montana? So those are the things I was thinking about.
So, well, I have a follow-up, kind of on the Montana March thing. One of the things that I'm not sure what other resources will be moving out of that path, and what would have changed over time such that Colstrip is still plugging along. So to me, it seems like if Colstrip is still pushing hard, it must be that since I'm only looking at the flow, I don't know. I mean, I shouldn't say must be, but my thought was most likely Canada. I mean, maybe there's someone else on the east that is having a tough time. I looked at a couple of the other plants out there. The capacity factor has been pretty much the same through all this time. And
well,
my other thought was,
and Colstrip is what, around 2,200 megawatts total, and it's really big, much bigger than all the other ones in Montana. And Montana is fairly isolated in that there's really very little capacity going up into Alberta or down south. So east-west flow, or east to west flow, is going to be the major thing. So consequently, they're kind of at the end of the line, and so anything shaken out in the middle of the of the Northwest is going to shake a little bit more on the Montana side.
but keep in mind, if you look at this plot. So this is a good discussion. This is actually what I'm hoping for. So if you look at this plot, so just take these 2 years only. So although every other year is, same story. 07, Colstrip full out January, on average. The availability on the path is about 500 megawatts. 2017, Colstrip continues to run full out. According to the SEMS data, it's from the EPA's emissions system. Continues to run full out, and yet there's hundreds more megawatts available off peak. And I really don't, unless I'm missing something, I just don't know what to make of that trend. I would have expected something about Colstrip to have changed. And so because nothing about Colstrip changed, it makes me think, since that's probably by far the largest exporter west to east, it makes me think that maybe there was some contracts, or maybe there's an additional transfer of energy scheduled, from Northwestern Zone projects or someone coming from the west to the east during those, off-peak hours as a new behavior that is changing the net flow across it. While Colstrip does nothing different, something outside of it is coming across that flow gate, and the net effect on the flow gate is the line's less heated. I don't know. I'm really not sure. And it's an important kind of thing to think about, because it's like, are we going to continue to have this availability? I mean, is this something real, or is this a market thing? Clearly it's marketing, but I don't know what it is. I really, if anyone has any additional kind of spitball ideas, John and I were talking about this, Joe and I talked about this, we don't know.
Dave Levy, Powercast, background is doing economic dispatch modeling. So my question, I guess, is, have we looked at and evaluated, and I think some of the comments that you made, Mike, is basically a lot of what we're seeing are based upon economic incentives and changes in behavior, certainly on resource operations, but also in consideration of transmission availability. And I guess in that regard, I think it's important to look at, and maybe you have, I'm unaware of it, what kind of the economic opportunity value, not only by, for all participants, basically, that utilize and make economic use of transmission. What is the economic signals? What do they do for counter scheduling? Prices in the market, spot prices, if you will, on transmission as well. And that evens out the usage and availability of transmission as well, because they make economic utilization and find economic opportunity for greater utilization, and also creates, a margin of value, if you will, based upon prices. Just similar to what you'd see in the airline industry when you change the pricing to the passengers on an airline, it fills up the plane, you get basically 100% utilization. You can see the same thing on a transmission line.
Well, I have a couple of thoughts. So one is, we don't, through any means that I'm aware of, we have not at the council had access to transmission spot prices, although I think seems like we might pick up a copy of, or pick up a license to the production node of Oasis and see what's available out there that might suit our needs. The second one that I would think about, and this is what makes this kind of tricky. And again, I guess I'm really strongly thinking just specifically about the implications for resource costs. That's really what we do, but just kind of in that vein, what I'm thinking about is, so if you were an area with some congestion or with some opportunity to move load around, it would make sense to me that, the airline analogy, I think, would make a lot of sense. I'm a little bit suspicious of that in an area like Montana, which in general is a net exporter, that you could see full utilization. For example, if we just take the most resource cost oriented look at this, I do not feel quite confident that you could make access to this transmission, free, but it would not for example, just specifically thinking about resource costs for wind, I don't think even if you made the access transmission free without a long-term firm offering on a radial or something that looked firm on a long radial line that, you know, in an area that's basically always a net exporter, I would be surprised if you'd see increased utilization because, at least from a third-party developer standpoint, I don't think that there's a huge risk there for them. I don't think that that risk would make sense to take, you know, to build in an area that only has some spot transmission availability, and if you don't get it for whatever reason, you don't have anywhere to go. I think that that's the challenge that I have with that analogy. But thinking specifically about January, I'm not sure. It's a good question. Yeah, maybe some Oasis transmission spot pricing would be helpful.
Mike, this is Jillian again. Do you see the comment from Greg Brownell on the chat?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question. Or a good. So Greg says, well, I think actually there is something to what Greg's saying. One thing, and I haven't really looked at this, could be is, let me think here. Yeah, see, so Greg was suggesting perhaps, in essence, that perhaps there's something going on in general, something going on with the Northwest and the shape of the LMPs that is causing us to change the Northwest export. You know, maybe we don't send it, for example, maybe we don't send it in the middle of the day and therefore we send it more off peak. I think, yeah, like Greg probably just realized that probably would have the opposite effect. The thing that's really striking to me that I just can't quite make sense of is Colstrip is still running full out and is by far the biggest exporter east to west. And so I don't know what else would make up that couple hundred megawatts of room. But I guess I would just back up, you know, if anyone has any thoughts, feel free to email me. I don't want to beat this to death. It's going to require some clever thinking, but it's important to, you know, as we look out, we say, well, there's this much transmission potentially available for some use. You know, we have to kind of have a sense of how confident we feel about that, just like any utility doing planning would have to, or any entity doing planning would have to feel. But you know, I want to see some of the other thoughts. I was actually, Julian, I appreciate you bringing that up. I missed that because I was trying to scroll up and look at Greg's earlier thought, which is, so what are some of the factors driving upward trends in ATC? I think that's kind of what we're discussing here. And then, so Paul Dietz says, this is from earlier that I punted and I want to get back to it. Does this effectively allow Pacific Northwest utilities to access Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado wind? Should we gain the benefit of transmission access via RTO membership? So that's a tough one to bite. I have no idea. So I'll offer my thoughts as a non-expert on this. I can't think of any major. I know there are a couple of lines that come out south towards Wyoming, but I don't feel like there's a substantial amount of I think like Pacific Core owns a small line out of there. I don't feel like it's a substantial, you know, Path 8 kind of has a certain direction. And I don't know that we have a strong tie to Wyoming. I feel like we have a relatively weak connection south, just because we'd be connected with another net exporter. I'm not sure how well that aligns with everybody else's understanding of that region.
Mike,
I have a thought on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, you go ahead.
I was just wondering, Mike, if you're talking, I'm not tracking this quite. Are you talking about when, you know, access to Wyoming wind, for example, or even Colorado? Are you talking about the connection between Montana and south at its path? I don't remember, path 48 or whatever it is. It's like 300 megawatts. It's tiny. Or are you talking about more generally what the system topology looks like between, you know, Montana and Colorado and further west?
So someone, just to restate the question, is basically does the fact that we have unused transmission potentially open up the opportunity for these utilities to access some of the, the wind resource in other states based on the fact that they have transmission rights on a path that has room. So the couple of thoughts that I was throwing out on that is, number one, so the first thing I would say is, I can't think of any reason why those utilities would need access to an RTO to tap that resource. They own the rights to the transmission, and the fact that it's unutilized just creates that additional opportunity for them. But it's hard for me to imagine, though, the next step, which is, and I think that's what you were getting at, just topologically, I don't think there's a very strong tie, enough of a aluminum, conductor tie to those areas where those resources are being built to be able to pull them in anyway. That's my just trying to pick, since I'm sharing my screen, I can't cheat and look it up, but that's my general understanding, as this is a very weak tie topologically to those areas.
Can I interject or offer something on that point? My chat thing for some reason is not working. I can no longer type, so I'll just talk. The thought that may have been behind that question is whether the transmission accesses under the same set of rules. So if it were using say PJM or Cal ISO rules, they don't really have the long-term transmission reservations, and everything is more priced on a market basis, and you can buy the value of the transmission, but not necessarily the physical use. And if an RTO were to take on a model like that, then perhaps the transmission could be more utilized.
Well, that's a great point. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective, like the Path 8 itself. That wouldn't provide any benefit to these utilities. The utility could certainly, so I'm speaking theoretically here, because I don't know who owns the unused line. But if one utility wanted to build, one wind turbine and send it down there currently on their own unused rights, they could. What an RTO would do in general is create an opportunity where you don't have all these newcomers who want to show up and access it get denied on the basis of zero ATC, which is exactly the point you were making. That's true. Yeah.
Mike,
so this,
before
go ahead.
Was that Paul speaking?
Sorry, what
oh, yeah. So the person who said, oops.
I just want to make sure we get in the notes who's speaking. So, Paul, was that you speaking?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that was Greg. That was Greg at eWeb.
Oh, that was great. All right, great. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Fred. Just a quick follow-up, which is, it may look like, if you have an RTO kind of situation with a monolithic approach to economic dispatch and all the transmissions available, et cetera, that this might improve things. But in reality, even if the Northwest were to join Western ISO or whatever it would be called, and there are 3 offers on the table right now for doing that, then there are usually going to be some kind of transition rules on the existing contracts. And the California ISO in particular has made that a big feature of their proposed approach, if they were to expand into a Western system operator. In addition, given Bonneville's situation as a federal power marketing administration and transmission owner, the arrangements with BPA, should BPA join such an entity in the future, might be different as well. So, for example, SPP has the Western Area Power Administration, Upper Great Plains area is in SPP now, but they have a special arrangement and I don't really remember all the details for it, but I don't know necessarily that having a total system operator or RTO approach would necessarily unwind all of these kinds of constraints that we're seeing right now.
I agree.
It's a good point. Yeah, maybe if they built it from the beginning. Yeah. There's actually a couple other things that make that challenging too, right? So, for example, and I hope folks understand. Like, this is the type of discussion I was hoping to have, because we're thinking about, arguments against and for saying transmission is, more or less needed and more or less expensive and so on. But one thing I think additional that's challenging that I would just add in kind of as a layer on top of that is, so BPA is offering a conditional firm product on their south of Austin path, and or is going to begin to develop it. And I'm not speaking about whether I think that the way that they set this up is financeable or whatever, but I'm just saying in general, you're at if you have that offering, you get curtailed after people with non-firm, so it gives you some more stability. But they don't offer that on any of the ties. So, if you remember back to that first picture that I showed, BPA, does not offer any product like that on, that little chunk from Townsend to Garrison called the Eastern Intertie. They don't offer a conditional firm product. And then in addition to that, there's some other contractual challenges where it seems that potentially only owners of the CTS system can transmit energy down it. And so, it would be challenging for someone to show up, for example, with their energy project at the Broadview substation, which is sitting right in the middle of the CTS system, and ask for transmission rights, from one of the owners of Colstrip, to the West Garrison BPA system, just because of the way that the contracts are set up. That's really more of a challenge, I think. This is going to be a continued discussion, but I think that's more of a challenge for, when Colstrip 1 and 2 retire, there'll have to be some change about that. But I do think that that's just one more kind of contractual layer that's challenging in that. Okay, so sorry, I didn't mean to do the discussion there. Yeah, other folks.
Yeah, I just had a quick question or quick comment. This is Jeff from PNGC Power. In regards to the ATC, I just wanted to make a quick comment that I'm mostly involved with South of Austin because that's our problem child that we're working on. But the ATC is a number that's set on the most congested hour of the entire year. So when you compare available flow through the entire year, it's just something to keep in mind that the available transfer capacity is basically set on the most in a long-term firm world is set on the most congested hour. So if you're comparing that doesn't speak to the trends, but it could speak to just it's obviously being used differently as we have gone in time. But if BPA is using the same hour, they're the 1 hour of the year that sets the ATC could not really be changing that much. But obviously the other months and other hours of the year are changing. But that the ATC is only set on that 1 hour. That's just the only thing I had to say about the ATC. That's good to be aware of.
So I'm waiting for other folks to react to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can wait.
Okay,
yeah, that assumption. This is Angela Tangeti. That assumption seems like it's hard to carry that into the future because the peak hour, depending on what region you're looking at, is very different. And when you're looking at California LMPs possibly impacting flows in this area, that's a tough one to base that ATC on. Just in
yeah,
our
it's definitely a conservative assumption, but they're like Mike stated, they're looking at conditional firm, because once you cut out the top 10 hours, like his chart showed, your availability obviously gets a lot bigger. But yeah, their BPA I think is they're working on it, but they're the 800-pound gorilla. So.
Okay. An interesting thought. We're struggling with this right now as well too, because we're building renewable portfolios in California, and there's different tools that we're using, and some are assuming that in order to get out of state renewables into California, you have to build new transmission, and there's others who are looking at it from a perspective, you have many coal plants. I mean, up to 16,000 megawatts in the WEC proposed to retire by 2030. Again, a majority of those are in Alberta, but again, and there's some who contend that these renewables can come over the existing transmission system, and we're told that it's already subscribed, that you can't make those assumptions for even 2027 or 2028. So this discussion for us is where it really impacts the portfolios that we put together, especially when we're looking at a 50% RPS by 2030, and we're trying to build it all in state with PV in San Bernardino County. So this discussion is timely for us too, as to what assumptions can we make to have that capacity subscribed for renewables for export. So thanks for this discussion.
So Angela, so just two things. One is, I don't know if we've ever met, but I feel like I see you on 1,000 calls, probably the WEC stuff.
Yeah.
So it'd be good to meet you someday. But were you describing that you're saying what you're hearing as far as being fully subscribed is transmission access outside of the ISO, the California ISO?
Outside of California, exactly.
Right, yeah. Okay.
So when the tools that they use to build portfolios, they assume that, only 2,000 megawatts of renewables can come in over existing. After that, the tools have to build new transmission, and so that's not cost effective. It's more cost effective to build PV in San Bernardino, according to these tools. But yet, if you try to change those tools and say, this 4,000 megawatts could come in over existing transmission, you get a much different portfolio. You get wind in Montana and Wyoming being cost effective if it could come in over available transmission capacity. So it makes a big difference in the portfolios that we develop versus in-state versus out-of-state.
Oh, cool. Okay, that's great. I didn't realize you guys were having that discussion. It's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to end on time. I also want to continue to have more discussion. So it's tricky, but I want to cut to a slide that's just here in 1 second. So this one. So a couple thoughts on how to continue to stay engaged. So number one is we're going to continue to collect info on, collect info in general, working towards resource cost estimates, bring forth the graph for the 8th plan. There's also a separate effort. I mentioned this kind of at the beginning. I had started thinking about this work last fall, and then it happened that also there's a separate effort being led by the administrator and Governor Bullock of Montana, looking at Montana renewables development. Been ongoing since, I think, in January. I can't quite remember. I just put beginning of year because I couldn't remember. And it's supposed to wrap up in June. And there's a couple of committees. There's a planning operations committee, commercial policy committee, and then a long-term planning committee. Each of them meet separately. I put the website here. You can also reach out to someone and get engaged. It's really productive. I found it to be really valuable. And, not at all having these same discussions, or not at all, but not having directly the same discussions, but really deep diving into some of them. It's, to me, it makes me feel proud of the region to see the stakeholders in there and having quite different points of view, but working together productively. So if you're interested in this, I really highly recommend getting engaged in that. And hopefully we can get more of the materials that we've developed put up on the website. And then separately, I just want to mention that we're also at the council working on updating our solar, wind, and gas costs. And that's really going to get done, concretely. So this work that we're talking about here, we're targeting kind of 8th power plan development timeline. But more concretely, we want to publish solar, wind, and gas costs as part of our midterm assessment. We're not rerunning all the models and so on. We just want to make sure that we don't have stale. We have a fresh update on our cost data to share for the region. And so, as always, we look to you guys as experts to help us to verify what we feel like we're seeing, looking across, RPs, PPAs, and so on. So we'll get those kind of gathered up and bring them back to share with you guys. I put April. I think we're thinking bring them to you guys in April and bring them to our council in May, as I recall. So that's what we have as next steps. And then kind of the one thing I just really want to make sure I get in here. I'm still struggling with everything we've talked about here. I'm really glad that we had an opportunity to share this with you guys, and some of the discussion we had has been really helpful for me. But I would really appreciate even more discussion, so we can re-engage as a group. But more importantly, even you can just shoot me or Jillian an email and or give us a call. We can talk about it more. I'd really appreciate any input or thoughts that we have. So I think we're wrapping up. Jillian, any other thoughts that you want to, or would you want to close us out here?
No, Mike, I think everything sounds great. Definitely we'll be sending out a doodle probably in the next week or so to get that April DRAC meeting on the books, because it's already mid-February somehow, and I know time just goes by fast, and I know at the council our meeting rooms are filling up too. So we will get that on the books soon. And yeah, thanks so much for engaging with us on this phone call and this webinar. I know it's not the easiest to do this all remotely, but I think it was a great discussion. Thanks to Mike for pulling all this information together. And yeah, like Mike said, definitely reach out to us, and if we need to schedule a follow-up webinar, if there's enough interest, we can absolutely do that and continue this discussion specifically.